Hey guys, I wanted to talk a little bit about language today. Actually, a lot about language today. In particular, Old English, the language of Beowulf. I mentioned a little bit about it before. So this is a British literature course. We could be reading works in any number of languages, from Scotch Gaelic to Welsh to French to Latin to more modern works, in Pashto, Hindi, Arabic, translated from these languages, obviously. But I chose a couple of these so-called masterpieces from the English tradition. And right now we're reading a work in Old English. I wanted to talk a little bit about what that meant. I've made just a silly amount of slides here, so I'm going to be going through them pretty quick, just kind of throwing out tons of different of information. So I don't know, you could watch it again if you wanted to. So Old English. I love this image here, by the way, because it's trying to capture in this sort of arboreal way just the tangled mess that is Indo-European, which is just a way of talking about just a ton of world languages from Iceland to India that seem to have descended from something like a common source, or at least we can tell a story about how all these languages descended from a common source. And it makes for very interesting comparisons and ways of reading texts and talking about language and grammar. But I wanted to talk about Old English because I think a lot of people sort of don't understand that term or misuse it. I don't know about you guys. I'm sure you are all totally on top of this sort of thing. But I wanted to sort of just strip away real quick, starting from the big poem we're going to be reading in the middle of this course, and just sort of stripping back like an archaeological dig through some layers of language to get to what we really mean when we say Old English. So what Old English doesn't mean is English that is old. Old-timey English or something like that. It doesn't mean like the English of Charles Dickens. It doesn't mean the English of Milton. It doesn't mean the English of Shakespeare, or even the English of Chaucer, just because they're old or they sound old. That's not Old English, or at least when they're capitalized, that's not Old English. So I'm not going to read all these. I'm just going to sort of flashback, strip down layers chronologically, going backward in time, and we'll notice a few things changing, although we're already seeing some things in Paradise Lost that are a little different. Though not linguistically significant in their differences. For instance, all these capitalized letters, forbidden tree, death in the world, etc. This is still very much modern English. Let's go back about 70 years. So this is probably very familiar to you in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to read it real quick, though. I'm going to read it in something like the pronunciation, or my best effort at pronouncing it the way that we think it might have actually been pronounced. Here goes. Tobe or not tobe, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. So what I'm trying to approximate there is that something called the Great Vowel Shift, which was super significant for the sound of our language, in particular the sound of our long vowels, this shift was in the process of happening, and it was not yet complete. For instance, it's not meaned, as in mind. It's not mind, as we would say it. It's not meaned, but it's mind, we suspect. Which is in the process of turning from a pure vowel, meaned, into a long vowel, or what we call a long vowel, a diphthong, mind. So like kind of pirate English. Let's go back about 60 years to the first part of a sonnet by one of the great poets of the Tudor era, the Henry VIII court, Thomas Wyatt. I'm not going to pronounce this out loud, but you might notice some things are creeping in. Like these little extra letters at the end of words. What's that all about? Some spelling that seems to, this is the word travail, here's vain. These words have sort of been, the spelling on these words has changed. Cometh, now there's something interesting. We would say comes. So this older ending of the vowel of the verb is still in Thomas Wyatt. Now let's go back about 100 years. 120 years or so, Geoffrey Chaucer, you probably maybe read part of this, Canterbury Tales. Wander April with his shore resuta, the drucht of March hath perse to the rota, and badere every vein in switch liqueur, of which vertu engendred is the flower. So one thing about this writing, this is a pretty accurate transcription from a manuscript, is that every single sound is pronounced. So that's a very different thing about older manuscripts and modern English writing. This concept of spelling, where not everything that you see is pronounced. Well, here everything is pronounced. It gets to something about the kind of texts that we're reading. They're not just giving you words, they're giving you a transcription of how it was pronounced. That's a very important distinction. Let's strip back a little further though. 1390, let's go back to somewhere in the 12th century. Oh man. So this is post 1066, that is after the so-called Norman Conquest. There's some very important things that are going on in this little poem about an owl and a nightingale kind of arguing with each other. Each was in ona someradalla, en ona suda dela hala, herdit holda grete tala, an hula and ona nightingala. So one thing that's happening here for about the first time in English is rhyme. You'll see these end rhymes, dala, hala, tala, gala. But you also hear me pronouncing those sounds a little differently because in older English, way on up to that great vowel shift, a few hundred years after this date that I was talking about, English was still pronounced with what are usually called pure vowels or even continental European vowels. Dala, not dale. Grete, not great. Nightingala, not nightingale. In other words, these vowels have the same quality in more or less as Italian and Spanish vowels do. So one thing about this, though, is that we're a good century maybe after the Norman Conquest at 1066. And I'm looking here, and I'm not seeing any words derived from French. So there's this sort of myth about the Norman Conquest that all of a sudden everybody started, all the language, English started changing, started ingesting French words, and it's simply not true. The Norman Conquest had massive implications for the history and the political situation of English society. It actually did not have as much an influence on the language as is always said. It is true that after 1066 and for the next 6 centuries, French words as well as Latin words and Greek words and Dutch words were being incorporated into the language at a much greater pace or rate. But it didn't start immediately. What's interesting about this poem, though, is that it is taking from French literature, from French literary tradition, this new, that is for English, new concept of rhyme. You'll remember we didn't see any of it in Beowulf. Rhyme is not part of Old English poetry. So there is one thing that came in after the conquest. And before any meaningful linguistic, oh wait, look, there's one French word, plate. Anyway, before any meaningful linguistic changes were happening on account of French, the poetry was incorporating French forms. So anyway, let's go back another century or two to when we suspect the manuscript of Beowulf was written down. And here is good, unadulterated, whatever that means, Old English. Og satt það ona seligust und hurra saksket Brad und brunage wolda hira barn rekan, angan avran, himonax la lei brest net broden, that he bar fewer, with orun with eja ingang forstod. All right, so what I meant to say when I said that Old English isn't just English that is old. Well, what we mean by Old English is a completely different language. And by that I mean a language that is mutually not intelligible, that is not mutually intelligible with modern English speakers. In fact, not even with this kind of English. This is what we call Middle English, the language of Chaucer. And this is what we call Middle English, despite it looking even probably more forbidding than that. A speaker of this language would likely not have been able to understand a speaker of this language. So Old English is referring to a different language. Now that's a strange thing to say though, because it's also true that there is an unbroken historical continuum between this language and our English. So they're no longer the same language, but they share a history, an unbroken historical continuum. It's very much as if we were to call Latin Old Spanish. Now, a Spanish speaker would not be able to pick up a book in Latin and just read it. And yet, there is an unbroken historical continuum with which we can link Latin, the Latin of ancient Rome, and the Spanish of today in Argentina or Mexico or Spain. So it's... here's this interesting image. It's not either, though. What this sort of image seems to suggest, and there's a lot of information going on here, I'm just going to throw this out, though, but what this kind of image seems to suggest is that there is a single line, that modern English, we might use metaphors and say like it evolved from Old English. I don't really like saying that myself. This would imply that language is somehow adapting, or that it's sort of improving toward some purpose, and what exactly would you say that purpose is? No, language hasn't really evolved. That is to say that modern English isn't somehow some better version of Old English, any more than English 200 years from now will be some better version of our English, or more evolved version. It's simply changed. So I'll talk a little bit about what those changes are, but there's something else about this image that I don't really like, and that is the linear nature of it, or there's a little bit of action here that seems to suggest a thickness. I like that. I want to talk a little bit about where English came from. Say one difference between the relationship of Latin and Spanish is that Latin has all kinds of daughters. We like use these terms, these like genetic terms, daughters, all of us, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, they've all descended or come from changes that have affected Latin. But Old English really only has one daughter, and it's modern English. Although even that might be contested. You could say there's Australian English, British English, American English, Indian English, South African English, but these languages are not mutually unintelligible. So we don't speak of them as different languages for that reason. But this sort of point A to point B model doesn't really work for a number of reasons. It doesn't capture the diversity and the multiplicity that has always been a part of English, of what we mean, or what we mean when we say this word English. So let's take a look at some maps real quick, which will take us sort of geographically through that timeline in the previous slide. This is a map of Britain when it was a colony of Rome, starting in the 50s BC and continuing until like the 400s or 500s. So looks like it's taking us to about 150 AD. There's not a whole lot of information that we need here because English has not yet come to the island. At this time, we're dealing with perhaps a very small population of Roman citizens who are basically the governing body of a relatively much larger population of Celtic language speakers, perhaps speakers of what became Welsh and Cornish. So this is outside of the story of English, yet it is very influential because these people, these Celtic speakers, Celtic language speakers, and even the Latin language speakers and the Latin language itself, they didn't leave. Although in around 400 or 500 AD, Rome was being pressed from multiple directions by invasions and problems that required the legions of Britain to pull out and be restationed elsewhere. So in that great power vacuum around 400 to 500, what was called Britain by the Romans was vulnerable. And so they started to employ mercenary armies who then decided, well, look, this place is ripe for the picking. How about we just go and live there? And those mercenary armies were, by and large, from what we call Denmark today. So here's some names you probably know. The Angles, whose tribes were in this region. The Saxons, who were more on the mainland, near what we would call modern-day Germany, and almost in the Netherlands. And then the Jutes, which is a really funny word. It's a funny sounding word, but it really in its own language was Eoten, which meant the giants. So that's pretty awesome. Whatever the case is, armies, massive populations from these areas started moving into the powerless area that became England. The name comes from Angles, and Anglo-Saxons is sort of a splicing of these two forms. But notice that these people called the Jutes also came and set up shop on this little eastern outcropping. So let's go forward to when the invaders became occupants and set up something like regional populaces and societies. This is a pretty old map, but you can see the names that already in Old English are being given to the regions of England, or of what became England. These are not yet, there is not yet a nation of England. I'll give you a little cleaner map here. There's not yet a nation of England. There's not yet a single England, and these aren't just sort of states within England. These are just separate, independent sort of municipalities governed by sort of bodies of warrior clans. So never mind the 5 boroughs, but let's focus on this coast here: Northumbria, East Anglia, and Kent. I'll go back a few steps to the map that showed sort of the inbound. You'll notice that the Angles set up in this region here, the Saxons in this region here, and the Jutes in this region here. Well, that corresponds to these sort of later political entities. Yeah, let me, like I said, I put way too many slides in here, but I just wanted to go through a little bit, super fast forward through the history of English, or of England as the home of this, something like a language. And I want to stress first, though, that in each one of these places, the dialect of Germanic, the separate, not maybe separate language, but at least separate dialect of those invading peoples, set up and was distinct from its neighbors. In other words, there was not just one English, and then later it broke up into different kinds of dialects. There never was one English. There always were already these different dialects as spoken by the different bodies of clans of invaders. So the Kent area was speaking something like Jutish. The Anglian area was speaking something like Anglian. The Northumbrian was speaking a different version of the same. And then Wessex and Essex were both speaking the dialects of the Saxon people. So over the course of the next couple hundred years, we're in the 800s, 900s now, another sort of flight of invasions from the same area came. Only this time they weren't speaking these languages anymore, English, Saxon, or Jutish. They were speaking Norse. They were the Danes, they were the Vikings. And they almost conquered the entire island, but for a sort of, or at least so the history says, but for this sort of massive concerted defense by a guy named King Alfred in the south. So at this point, this entire region, which became known as the Danelaw, the place where the Danes' law obtained, there were a small number of, or a relatively small portion of the population speaking Old Norse, and they were the ones with the power. So you have at this point, though, not like a new people, but just another layer. Old Norse speakers over English and Judish, English and Saxon and Judish speakers over Celtic speakers, and even still a Latin laity that is a clerk and church infrastructure where Latin is spoken. It's just a massive amount of layers, no single language. So England sort of managed to fight back the Vikings for a while, but right before the French conquest, the Norman conquest in 1066, England fell entirely to a Danish emperor named Knut the Great, and this is basically his empire here. So back to this map, though, I wanted to focus again, or just reiterate this important thing, that there was never a single English on this island. There were many different dialects, for which English is not even a very good name, since it seems to refer only to the Angles. However, these different dialects came in differently from the continent, from the get-go. So if we fast forward a little bit to the 14th century, these are sort of showing the main different districts of England in the time when we're speaking something like Chaucer's language, Middle English. And you might notice that they're roughly corresponding to these original Old English, Anglo-Saxon and Jutes geographic regions. So these are basically also a map of the foundational dialects that are still there in England today. Northern dialects, Midland dialects, Southern, Western, and Eastern dialects. English has never been a single thing. It was never a pure single thing from which dialects descended and broke off, or any of these metaphors. It has always already been a diverse, multiplicitous sort of mess, which is why rather than that timeline, I prefer something maybe that would look more like this for the history of it. Lots of different nodes or intensities of difference which are intersecting and mutually informing each other. Maybe it would look something like this. You know, Celtic underlying Latin sort of cultural superstructure, various tribal languages from the continent, invading Vikings from the north who were just, you know, as much part of English history as anybody else. The Norman French, later Parisian French, and of course, internet. So, you know, all of these things have sort of become different intensities or different sort of contact zones of dialects. English is a big cultural mess. So when we see like a nice neat tree or a timeline, we're really deceiving ourselves a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit, starting off pretty easy, about what Old English is and what modern English keeps from it, or how it relates at all to us. So let's take a couple words, just a couple words, and then I'm going to talk about something more important than just words, which is grammar. So for now, though, let's take a word like night. I don't know if you guys know Monty Python, but you might know the scene where I think it's like French castle guards are yelling down to the Kniggets, which is sort of making fun of this word, this ridiculous word, night. So the funny thing about the word night, though, is a sort of funniness that is inscribed in lots of our modern English spelling. So English famously doesn't pronounce words like they're spelled. So that's sort of a pain in the ass to an English language learner, you know. But it's actually quite useful because our funny spelling is the way it is not because it's trying and failing to transcribe the sound, but because it is retaining the history of the sound of that word. So the word night is on a direct line of descent from an Old English word meaning servant or even just boy or man. And you see that at the bottom. Here's how that word is pronounced. Knecht. Notice every sound is pronounced. So the spelling that we have at the top, although it's changed, is reflecting the original spelling that is the original sound of this word. It's evolved over time. We don't like having sound clusters kn anymore in the beginning of words, and we don't like having puffs of air before our T's. But Old English did. That was just part of the language. So this word is retaining something of the sound quality of the original. Lots of our spelling, especially when it's particularly wonky, is doing just that. Let's take another word, similar word, the word white. Well, like I just said, Old English does not write a sound that is not pronounced. So this word at the bottom, which means white or clear or bright in Old English, is wheat. Maybe you've heard some uppity people say white, but that's exactly, that is retaining the old sound production of this word, wheat. So if you end up looking at it, I'm going to upload or I'm going to send out to you a version of Beowulf that has the Old English on it. If you want to read it, there's just a couple things I need to say for you to probably kind of get the idea enough to read it. One is, every letter is a sound. Everything is pronounced. And the other thing is, those vowels sound like Spanish. You even trill your R's like Spanish. Basically, it sounds like, yeah, you can kind of do an Old English by just sort of sounding like Shrek. So that's not an official linguistic description, but here is an official linguistic description of the differences that matter between modern English and Old English, which have nothing to do with the sound and nothing to do with just the vocabulary, has everything to do with grammar. I'm going to show you kind of what I mean by this in terms of nouns, but for now, I want to give you a couple words, linguistic terms, to describe that difference that is significant between modern English and Old English. So modern English is what we call an analytic language. This is a grammatical term. In an analytic language, relationships between words and ideas are conveyed by word order and helper words, like prepositions like with, for, to, etc., and auxiliary verbs like I will go, I shall go, I would go, helper verbs. So Old English, by contrast, was an inflecting or a synthetic language. Those aren't exact synonyms, but they get to the same point in this case. And in this way, Old English is acting like its sisters in Indo-European languages, like Russian and German and Icelandic. It inflects. What does that mean? It means that relationships are conveyed, sorry, there should be an S there. Relationships are conveyed, relationships between words and ideas are conveyed by changes in the form of the word and by prefixes and suffixes. So by changes. So we still have some of this. When we say swim, swam, swum, we are being very Old Englishy. We're being very Indo-European, and we're being very inflecting. That word, the sound of the word is changing to indicate what the tense is, and it's not adding an ed. So when we add an ed to the end of the word, we're being very newfangled. A very non-Indo-European way of doing things, like I kicked, I have kicked him. Notice that there's not change to the actual word, the sound of the word kick. We're just adding something, a suffix to the end. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind, a little titillizing factoid, but it's very significant, and this is what makes the languages different and not just sort of a different form of the same. So I wanted to just real quick, so I can get to what this matters for us. I wanted to real quick get to really what makes Old English poetry what it is, and that is how nouns work. So here's just a super breakneck speed micro lesson in what I meant by inflecting and synthetic in terms of nouns. So I had kind of drummed this up for a different use in a different course, so work with me. So nouns in Old English could take 4 different forms in the singular and 4 in the plural. But those 4 different forms are called cases, and those cases had names based on Latin terms for the same kind of thing. The form, a noun could be in the form called the nominative form, in which case it would be the subject of the sentence. It could be in the accusative form, in which case it's the direct object of the sentence, but not just that. It could also just be in that form, and it could mean like the duration of an amount of time, or it could be the object of some prepositions. It could be in the genitive form. Well, we still have this one. This is the possessive form, but it could also do all kinds of other stuff. So the difference between cat and my cat's pajamas or whatever, that S at the end of it is actually an old case. It is a leftover of inflection. And finally, there was a dative form. That is the indirect object. We still do this a little bit when I say, I gave him the book. That him is remembering the use. Now, notice I don't have to say to him. I can just say, I gave him the book. So that's reflecting this old case called the dative. Here's what I mean by sorts of changes. We're going to look at the word for the wolf. So in modern English, the wolf eats him. So in our modern English form, this is the subject of the sentence. In Old English, that would be expressed by a certain form called the nominative. Se wolf ateth hinne. So contrast that with the accusative, or excuse me, here's the plural first. So the wolves eat him. Tha wolvas ateth hinne. So here's something special. Notice you change even the article, the definite article. You don't just add stuff or change the word, you change the article as well. Se wolf is the wolf, and tha wolvas is the wolves. Now, all right, so what if I want to say the wolf in the object of the sentence? He eats the wolf. It changes. He ateth thon a wolf. Now, really what's changing here is the definite article, but you can't not change it. It's not just se wolf again, it's thon a wolf. And there's the plural as well, changing yet again. All right, so what if I want to speak of the wolf in a possessive context? The wolf's mouth is big. Well, here, look, now both definite article and noun have to change forms. Thas wolvus moodhis mitchell. Now it gets even a little more intense here, because now the plural and the singular forms part ways more dramatically. The wolves' mouths are big. Thara wolva mudas sind mikla. All right, I'm moving fast here, I know. I'm just trying to give a taste. Notice, by the way, that we still have a genitive sneakily doing its old time construction in modern English. Like when I say Wednesdays, the wolf goes to the park, or Wednesday weekends, he runs from the wolves. It turns out this is not a plural. This is remembering the old genitive of time structure. This means each Wednesday, not all Wednesdays or something. Each Wednesday the wolf goes to the park. So it's not the plural and it's not the possessive. It is the genitive of frequency of time, a holdover from old English synthetic structures. All right, we have one more case to look at real quick, the indirect object. What if I want to give something to a wolf? Well, he gives the wolf food. it changes again. He giveth them wolve mete. And in the plural, he gives the wolves food is he giveth them wolvum mete. Now I know I threw a lot at you just then, but let's look at it all in resume. And I'm looking over in this Old English column. Notice how the word the wolf, the definite article in the noun, has to change pretty dramatically in each different context. So that's how synthetic languages work. Another thing about this, let's just take this one here, and I didn't make a separate slide for this. Because that is telling us that this is the direct object, no matter what, I could put this in front, and I could put the subject on this side, and it wouldn't matter. I could say, though a wolf ateth hay, and it'd still mean he eats the wolf. And I could do that with every one of these, because the word is changing to tell us what it's doing in a sentence. Word order doesn't necessarily matter. So what? So that's a little super lightning quick rundown of the kinds of things that Old English does that modern English doesn't. The way that it inflects and the way that it changes the shapes of words to indicate the relationships of the ideas and the words of the sentence. So what for our purposes? What can we say about Beowulf with this sort of thing? Well, I gave you nouns for a reason. It's because Old English poetry, like the real specific poetics of Old English poetry, it's really in the nouns. Old English poetry is very verb light and noun heavy. So let's take a look at a passage real quick, and this is the last little set. This is the passage that introduces Grendel in the poem. So I'll read it real quick, just so you get a little taste of the sound. Whasse grimme gast Grendel hatten, mere merkstappa, sedamores hold, fen on fasten, fifelkunes ard, wons alawer, weardode huile, sidan him schippend forskriven havde, and keines kune, thona qualm je raak eche drichten, das de he abel slow. So I gave you also the translation in Seamus Heaney. This is the one that we're reading over to the right here. So I'm going to highlight now the nouns of this passage. And we'll take a little look at how they're sort of working together. So what you're seeing here is a lot of what's called apposition. That is when you sort of, you stack up nouns in a sentence. They're all referring to the same thing, but each one adds a different sort of name or color to the thing you're talking about. So for instance, if I said, the big man went to the store. The big man is in apposition. How about if I said like, I don't know, the monster, the dreadful beast eats people. You know, whatever the case is, the monster, the dreadful beast. Now, I didn't say and dreadful beast. I didn't say the monstrous and dreadful beast. I said the monster, the dreadful beast eats people. That's an example of apposition too. You're sort of stacking up nouns to kind of focus the image of the noun or the thing that you're talking about. So let's see how that plays out in Old English, this little snippet of Beowulf, and this is very much a distinctive feature of Old English poetry and how it creates its images and how it works. Seamus Heaney's translation is beautiful, but it's not catching how this works. He's taking the parataxis, that is the stacking up of ideas without connective threads, and he's turning it into syntax, which is how you are all taught to write, using connective words like but, however, therefore, like the for the killing down here. So he's making it sound and work like modern English. Now I'm going to replace Seamus Heaney's translation with one that I did. It's a horrible translation, but what it's trying to do is capture the apposition and capture the parataxis, the stacking up of ideas, as opposed to stringing it along by connective tissues. So I've readed everything that is referring to Grendel. You'll notice there's a lot that is referring to Grendel. And I've blued things that go together, and then down here it gets a little iffy. But I'm going to go through this to sort of show you what I mean. And we'll refer back to Hamish Seeney's. Grendel was the name of this grim demon haunting the marshes, marauding, you know, the ing, the haunting, marauding, not there in the Old English. What it says is, there was this grim demon, se grimme gast, Grendelhatten, called Grendel. Monstrous marchwalker, markstappa. Notice there's no ing words. It's another noun packet. It's in apposition. All right, so now we leave him for a minute. Who held the moors, fens, and fastness. So there again, there's no ing word and there's no connective. The moors is in apposition with fens and fastness. It's just adding a little more definition to what we're looking at when we say the moors. And look, it happens again. Domain of giant kin. Once more, another noun stacked on top of the other ones, just giving us a little more attention or a little more detail. And now, yet another apposition. And we know that this one goes with what we were talking about before because it's in the nominative singular. And it can't go with this stuff because this stuff is in the accusative. So you get a little sense maybe of how it works. Friendless man, giving you yet one more image to fasten onto so we can sort of understand what we mean by Grendel. All right, so kept for a time after him. All right, so I translated this just totally literally, but this is an example of Old English not caring as much about word order. Him is the object of the sentence. Shippened is the subject of the sentence. It has to be. It's the form that the word is in. So we don't need to worry about word order. So the creator had banished him. We can say this sort of what we would say backwards, but Old English didn't think it was backwards. This is just how they constructed it, using that synthetic property of the language. Among Cain's kin. That penalty did carry eternal Lord. Once again, because we know that this has to be the object of the sentence, doesn't matter where it goes. This sentence, this is the subject, the eternal Lord, carried out, we could say, that penalty. For the reason that he, Abel, slew. So the he is referring back to the nearest noun that makes sense, Cain, yeah? Abel is the object of the sentence, slew. So we like our sentences to be subject, verb, object, basically. Old English, here's subject, object, verb. Here is object, subject, verb. It can go in lots of different directions because the words themselves are sort of telling you what form they're doing. But Old English poetry exploits this quality of its grammar in order to make these elaborate, stacking, layered images, which is really the point I wanted to get across in this little lecture. It's something to look out for, especially if you have the time to sort of glance over at your Old English a little bit. Most of what you would see over on that Old English side of the page are nouns. Old English poetry is really a poetry of nouns, which is to say, I think, that it's a poetry of images, and ever more elaborate or refined or layered images. And that, in a way, is an expression of the grammar of Old English. So, yeah, I think that's everything I kind of wanted to say at the moment. It looks like it according to my little notes down here. So I guess I'll leave that to you to ponder a little bit. I could go on and on about this sort of stuff. But it's, I think, worth keeping in mind that just how Old English is working is allowing a very different kind of poetry than we'll see later in this course. One more thing I'll say while I have you, I'll include this in an email, is that I put up a reading. It's an essay by J.R.R. Tolkien, maybe the most important essay about Beowulf. It really turned the focus of scholars from the poem as an artifact of the language, which we've been talking about, and allowed people to start reading it as a classic of literature, that is, as a great poem. So that's up on Canvas, and I'll send it to you. And I'll talk to you guys very soon. Have a good rest of the